purposes of medicine, but it isn't explaining how you get new species and new kinds of things, just trivial variations within an unchanging type. And thus has been said of Darwin's masterpiece, titled On the Origin of Species, yes, well, we're really telling them there just is another way to think about all this, and let's look at the actual evidence that your textbook gives of this. And I just want to look at one issue, I would tell them, and that is the mechanism. I will not dispute, though I don't affirm either, that there has been a long, slow process of evolution over millions of years, which has taken the world of the living world from primitive one-celled organisms to up to the highest form of life known. Those of us here, or Governor Schwarzenegger, for example, Bill Clinton, whatever you select as the outstanding human being of our time. I'll allow that all happened, if you like. I won't dispute it at any rate. The question is, what mechanism brought all this about? So I always go to say it's the mechanism that is the issue. And that's what Charles Darwin contributed. There were ideas of evolution going back to the ancient world, the ancient Greeks and Romans. Greek Epicurus, the Roman poet Lucretius, all published theories of evolution, but they didn't have a mechanism. It was just a story that they could tell. So it's Darwin's mechanism that made evolution scientific. But how does a single-celled organism, a bacterium, let us say, become a multi-celled organism like a plant or an animal? How does this exactly happen? The textbook examples of the evolutionary mechanism are all of trivial changes within a pre-existing species. And see, the examples that they give, the two leading textbook examples are the peppered moth, the moths that, one day a dark-colored moth appears in a population of light-colored moths, and then eventually the whole population becomes dark-colored because the story goes that the trees that the moths sit on during the day were light-colored, and the dark-colored moths originally stood out on light-colored trees and got eaten by the birds. But then the Industrial Revolution came. The air in the forest became filled with smoke. The smoke descended on the trees, and the trunks turned dark. And now the dark moths were camouflaged on the dark trees, and the light moths stood out. So the birds could eat the light moths. The population eventually became all dark. That's natural selection. Okay, very well. I say that. Suppose that happened just that way. It may well have. I don't dispute it. But what does this tell us about how you get moths, trees, birds, and scientific observers in the first place? It tells us absolutely nothing. The whole story starts out with all those things present. Now, that story has been replaced in the textbooks largely with a new one. The new story is one about a population of little birds, finches, on an island in the Galapagos chain in the Pacific Ocean off of the coast of South America. Now, the story that they tell is that this island had a period of drought, just like California, and at the end of the drought, most of the birds had died because the seeds that they eat had dried up. So now, when the scientists who visited that island measured the beaks of the birds before and after the drought, and after the drought, they found that the beaks were very slightly larger than before. So the beaks had changed that small bit. It's a very small amount of very small beaks on very small birds. But theorized quite reasonably that the reason that the average size of the beaks had changed is that the larger beaked birds had an advantage in eating the last tough seeds that remained on the island. And so that's how it happened. Natural selection again. No reason to deny it. Then, some years later, the rains came again, and the island was ravaged by floods instead of drought. And this time, most of the birds died. They were drowned. They drowned, and it's a tough place to. The birds lead a tough life there. So and after the floods, they measured the beaks again, and they had gone back to the normal size that they were before the drought. So there was an increase in beak size, followed by a decrease back to the situation as before. Now, this was supposed to have shown how the birds, these little birds, could have become eagles or eventually bears and gorillas. But what does it show us about how we get the birds in the first place, and how we get the forms of life that they came after, the camels and giraffes and apes, human beings? It doesn't show us anything, because it's showing relatively trivial change within a fundamentally unchanging species. That's it. All the major examples of the evolutionary mechanism are like that. So that they show that another thing that is shown is that they make a great deal of is that bacteria, like single-celled creatures that live in your body, may cause illness in some cases. And then you get a life-saving antibiotic drug like penicillin, and that when you're injected with penicillin, this kills off most of the bacteria, but not all of them. A few of the bacteria will be particularly hardy at resisting the effects of this poison, as they consider it, and so they live. And it's only the penicillin-resistant bacteria which have offspring. And so the resistance is something which can be inherited. It's passed on to the next generation. So eventually, that generation has its own offspring, its own little bacteria babies, and they all have the resistance that their parents and grandparents had. And all the other non-resistant bacteria die off. So eventually that population becomes 100% penicillin-resistant bacteria, or germs if you prefer. That means that penicillin doesn't work so well anymore, and you have to develop a new wonder drug to save people from sickness. But what does this tell us of how we get the bacteria in the first place? And what does it tell us about how we got birds and camels and human beings? Nothing at all. It's a trivial change within a fundamentally unchanging species. Also, when you